All right. Well, we're really happy to see you guys here for the second in a series of special programs that are being put on by the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship here at Brown University. This is called Mentoring in Focus. We had one about a month ago or so, and at the end of this session, we'll put a link to the prior session. And watch your newsletter feeds and whatnot for the next one, which will happen in June. So my name is Jason Harry. I'm really happy to be here with you. I'm on the faculty here at Brown, nominally in the School of Engineering, and I teach undergraduate and graduate level entrepreneurship and innovation management. And it's my really great pleasure and honor to be working in the Nelson Center in the summer as the director of the Breakthrough Lab, which we also call B Lab. And so what I'd like to do is acknowledge a couple of the other Nelson Center staff who are here without any fancy introductions. Danny Warshay, Executive Director of the Nelson Center, thank you for coming in. Boy, I know you need help with mentoring. Not. And Liz Malone is here. She's the Associate Director of Programs at the Nelson Center, and Abby Dermaz is also with us today. Well, in my role of in teaching and doing B Lab and so forth, I reckon I've probably mentored maybe 150 or so, and I'm not making that up, student ventures. And I have a confession to make. I still am not that good at it. I am embarrassed to say I'm always learning more. In fact, I just kind of listened to a podcast about this a day or so ago, and I'm still learning, trying to get better at it. It's harder than it seems to be an effective mentor for student ventures. And I keep saying student ventures because that's a special kind of mentoring, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But I thought I'd just take a second, since folks are piling into the room, to put a poll up to just find out from you kind of what your experience is with student mentoring, student venture mentoring. So if you could take a moment, there's a poll. It's have you done quite a lot of it, or just a little bit, or maybe you've taught students, but not necessarily about business ventures. Or maybe it's been a while since you've had any kind of a conversation with a college age person, and so there may be a lot to learn. So yeah, take a second. This will give us a sense of kind of just and you all a sense of kind of who's in the room and what people might be actually trying to get out of this session. So just another moment or two, and then we'll show you the poll results. Great. So Abby, why don't we go ahead and display the poll results? And it's really interesting, actually. There's a diversity of experiences. Nobody is fessing up to not having spoken to a college student anytime recently. But it looks like for the most part, there's not a lot of experience doing mentoring for student ventures. So that's what we're going to do today. Let me get my situation organized here. I'm going to use this kind of fancy thing to kind of try to stay on screen a little bit and show my slides over my shoulder. Our game plan for today is really pretty fast and action packed. I'll show you kind of what our action plan is. The goal for today really is to just get you a little bit, some of the language, some of the techniques, some of the rough spots in mentoring student ventures. So that's, nobody's going to turn anybody into a mentoring expert in just an hour. But my hope really is that you'll go away with some concrete tips and get to a place of greater confidence in your interaction with students on business ventures. So I'm gonna talk for about 15 minutes. I have a very few prepared slides that I hope will be interesting and useful to you. And then we've teed up 7 actual student venture founders. These are students who are coming into B Lab next week. And so I put out a call for volunteers to, it's sort of like a role play kind of a deal, but not overly fancy. They're just going to describe their venture and an issue that there's a real issue that they're struggling with. And we'll ask for a volunteer mentor in each of the breakout rooms, and then we'll come back together again and share some experiences. So there's one FAQ, one frequently asked question that I often get from new mentors who are going to be embarking on this adventure, and that is, well, how do I know how to mentor them if I don't know what their experience is in business and venturing? And so what I can tell you is that by and large, they're inexperienced compared to you. But there's a pretty broad spectrum of experiences, and don't be afraid to just ask them what their experiences are. But what you should know is that many of them will have been exposed to, because they hang out at the Nelson Center, either virtually or in real life. Uh, Many of them will have sort of brought on board the sort of standard what we use as a three-step process for entrepreneurship, and that in very brief form is: step one is to really have a clear understanding of customer unmet need, and that's bottom-up research and top-down research and market segmentation, and really trying to grapple with what the clear definition of the unmet need is. Step two is to be able to articulate a prospective solution to that need. And step three, be able to detail what we often call a sustainability model. That's sometimes a business model, a profit model, a revenue model. Not necessarily the full up business plan, but just a clear picture of how this could be a sustainable business, whether a for profit or a not for profit. Lots of students, and again, this is what you can discover just by asking them. Lots of students will have been in classes or in B Lab here at Brown, sort of the zero to business plan in 13 weeks kinds of things. There are a couple of courses at Brown that are of that nature. But you really should imagine that they have a fairly good idea of at least what they're attempting to do in their venture. And it's fun because a lot of mentors often comment to us offline. They go like, "Wow, I didn't know anything close to that when I was their age." So even though they're sort of green in business, I think in general, if you're working with a student venture, you'll be pretty darn impressed. So, as the most fundamental sort of mentoring framework, it really kind of boils down to, what am I supposed to be? Am I a teacher? Am I an advisor? Am I a decider? And so this is kind of the language that I use to sort of separate these things. So if you're teaching, you're talking more about how to think and prioritize about issues. You're spending as much time sort of pointing to where they might find answers to the questions that they have. And this is kind of goofy, but sentences that you say to your mentees often start with something like, "You might consider," and then something following that. Decisions are going to be correct, and maybe you'll actually lower the risk of success, um, risk to success. And then finally, if we think about the individuals and the development of them, the things tend to flip. And so, being in teacher mode, you're actually sort of developing, capability, knowledge, confidence, leadership skills in the individual that you're whom you're mentoring. Whereas if you're doing a decider kind of thing, it's more that you're turning them into followers and functionaries. And so perhaps obviously that last category is the purview of mentoring. We're really trying to focus on the development of the individuals and the success or failure of the venture, at least in this student kind of, in a university sort of setting. The success or failure of the venture takes a back seat. It's not like it's not important at all. It just takes a back seat to our role as mentors to help the students, the individuals, the founders of the ventures, to make personal progress in being able to, swim in the dangerous sea when they leave the college environment. So if we think about, those three activities on a scale, I don't want to get over carried away and say you should always be in the green zone. Uh, but I want to encourage, as you think about interacting with students and student ventures, it should be a little bit more towards the teaching side, and really the deciding side is much more, that's more dangerous territory. You're not really meant to be an operating person in their venture. You're not meant to be an executive chairman or or a CEO or anything in the company. And so the activities are sort of vacillating or sort of sliding back and forth between teaching and advising. I don't want to say that you should never advise, but as you think about how you're going to interact with students, you uh, try to move more towards the teaching end of the spectrum than just spouting advice. But I just thought I'd tell you why it's so hard to avoid giving advice. It's, actually the reason it's so hard is that we all think we're this guy. Sort of a semi-professional softball player, and what we imagine is that, my goodness, if we can just they're gonna these students are gonna send me just they're gonna send me a nice big fresh head of lettuce, and I'm gonna just smack that thing out of the park, and it's gonna be impressive. They're gonna be amazed at how brilliant I am, and how I just crushed whatever that problem was they were having. I just crushed it. The issue is that, unfortunately, often it looks more like this, that you wind up and you're going to hit it out of the park, and in fact your helmet falls off and you fall to the ground, and you you're not actually as helpful as you think you're going to be. So at any rate, I know that's a little bit goofy, but I just thought I would put that out there. Maybe memorable. Just the thing about the lettuce is pretty cool. But you know what? Again, on that spectrum of teaching and advising, and recognizing that it's not practical all the time to try to play like a counselor or a therapist, and like, well, I don't know, you know how does that make you feel, and let's think about this and that, and why don't you guys go look for the answer. Sometimes that's just not practical, and they're kind of like nuts and bolts things that the students will ask of you, and you're allowed to be responsive, and I encourage you to be responsive on those things, and not to worry over much about being too much of an advice giver, as you strive also to be a teacher. And one of the reasons that I want to say that you don't have to worry too much about it is, we tell the students these two things as about receiving advice and mentoring. One is that, and I tell them, this is absolutely what I tell the students. I say, nobody knows your venture better than you know your venture. And most students don't believe me. They think of you guys, these very experienced mentors, as just knowing so much more than. But I say, yes, the mentors are smart. Yes, the mentors have super useful experience, life experience, and business experience, and venturing and investing and all that kind of stuff. But nobody, I swear to you, nobody knows your venture better than you. And that's partly, and I think you can see why that is. The mentors aren't living the venture. They're not having the conversations that the founders are having. They're not dialed in the way these young and inexperienced venture founders are. They're not dialed into it, and so they just can't know as much about the venture as the founders themselves. And the other thing we tell them is, and this is really important, treat every piece of advice from anybody, whether it's a designated mentor or somebody that you meet through networking or whatnot. Treat everything everybody tells you as a data point. Don't act on what people tell you to do. Bring information in, and act on your best judgment on the basis of the data you've collected from smart people out there in the real world. And that's because, I mean, obviously, some people say go that way, some people say go that way, and young entrepreneurs are like, I don't. Well, but if this is just a data point and that's just a data point, you drink that stuff in, synthesize and analyze, and everything will be fine. So here's some specific tips that you might think about, deploying in your role as a mentor. So it's less talking, active listening, more questions. This notion of maintaining curiosity, I think, is a really interesting concept. It's so tempting when you start to hear about a business problem to say, "Oh yeah, I got it. I know exactly what you're talking about. Here, this is where you need to go." It's it's actually more constructive to hang back a little bit, learn more, ask more questions, do that active listening trick of saying, what I think I hear you say is thus and such, or do I have this right, and that kind of stuff. And another sort of concrete tip is this notion of discovery through open-ended questions. And I took this from a pretty popular book called The Coaching Habit. And there are actually 7 questions. The first 3 seem most relevant for our situation. And so it's kind of like a standard opening question might be, what's on your mind today? You can ask, and what else? That your mentee might say, oh, what's on my mind today is X, Y, and Z. And then rather than just immediately jumping on that and working to solve that problem, just pause for what else is on your mind. And then this notion of analyzing what's the real challenge for you is sometimes an inexperienced and honestly even experienced people have the same trap that they're so focused on something that is bugging them right at the moment that they kind of miss the bigger picture. So by hanging back just a little bit, you'll learn more, and I think you'll be more helpful. And then finally, just as a guideline for mentor-mentee relationships, a couple of things. You might actually be scary to students, and I'm really serious about that. The reason, it depends on the age and the experience of the student. This conversation that you're having as a mentor-mentee might be among the very few that they've had with somebody who's not an adult conversation, might be among the very few that they've had, with non-family members or not a teacher. And so I just want to point that out to you because they're pretty early in their professional lives. And so it's often cool to establish a little bit of rapport with your mentee by trying to figure out some kind of shared experience or shared interests and so forth. And also, and this is quite important, and it was actually the subject of the first of this series of focus on mentoring. It's important that you be aware of different personal histories. Entrepreneurs are not all cut from the same cloth, especially these days. And so I want to sensitize you just briefly to the fact that it's likely that you'll be talking to people with very diverse ethnic backgrounds. Sometimes they're international students, have a vastly and non-American viewpoint. And that's important to kind of take on board. And you can actually, I've learned so much by working with international students about what the society is like and what business is like elsewhere in the world. So that's one thing. It's also important to realize that not all entrepreneurs come from your socioeconomic background. And that probably goes without saying, but it's important to kind of have it in the back of your mind because sometimes the things that you advise, they tend to be nuanced, and they can sort of creep up in strange ways. I mean, just even saying, oh, I think your next step is to raise a friends and family round. Well, there may not be a friends and family network for an entrepreneur that they can just kind of like dial for dollars out there in the friends and family network. And even suggesting operational things like, oh, hey, you could get a 3D model of that printed for just a couple $100. It's important to have a prototype to show people. Well, couple $100 may be out of the reach of some of entrepreneurs. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't suggest that those different things, but just contextualize them with your sensitivities about the fact that people come from very different personal histories. Okay. Well, that's really all I have as warm up. I hope that was interesting and useful for you. I'm going to pause for just a second and see if there are any questions or reflections on that. Welcome to have you raise your hand if you want me to call on you, or you're more than welcome to put something in chat. Our next item of business really is to drop into these. Breakout rooms, but I'll just pause for a second, see if anybody has any reactions, positive, negative. I don't know. I know I talk fast, but Rob, great to see you. Thanks for making time to come. What's on your mind?
Oh, I was actually just applauding your presentation that I really
Oh, okay. Applause is welcome. A standing ovation with little clapping hands in the corners. Thank you, Rob.
I think everything you say resonates with me, and it's all about making them feel comfortable and communicating. It's just like you said, a lot of these are first time. They're just getting their feet wet, and just
Right.
anything you can do to lift them up is going to help them.
Right, right. Well, thank you for that. And Rob is actually a very experienced student venture mentor. He's been a big part of the Nelson Center for years. So thank you for thank you for coming to maybe learn a tiny bit more, but you could probably have taught this thing brilliantly. So, Chris, I see a hand. What's on your mind?
Hey, Jason. Yeah, I have a question kind of relating to where this might fall in terms of your sort of teaching or advising spectrum. And I know oftentimes in my own case, like when I'm working with, students or junior members, my sort of approach might be to, sort of say like, if it were me, I might be concerned with X and suggest Y, Z. But one of the things I've always wondered and come up against is oftentimes with junior people, then they go and do exactly Y and Z. So how do you sort of parse that where you want to offer some guidance and some suggestion, but there's still sort of, unfortunately, that, like you mentioned, sort of that might be the first sort of adult. There's still sometimes that almost hierarchy or something, and they feel maybe obligated to follow that.
Yeah, no, you're really onto an important theme, and I don't think I don't have a glib answer for how to fix that. I think part of our training, at least in the Breakthrough Lab and also other circumstances in the Nelson Center, about how to receive mentoring, and is actually key on the student side. This notion of treating advice as data points and so forth. The only thing I would suggest, maybe, Chris, is that you actually say the things that you just said out loud just now. If it were me, I might think about doing X, Y, or Z. Throw in a couple of more things that just that maybe you wouldn't do if it were you, but would give them some options to think about, and then specifically say, I'm not saying you should go do this. I'm just saying that when I've experienced similar circumstances, these are the things that have worked for me in the past. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Dan, I see your hand up. Thank you for joining us. Dan Holmander is also a steady contributor and IP attorney, and a great help to B Lab and other Nelson Center things. Dan, what do you have?
Jason, first of all, excellent presentation. I've learned a lot. Um,
Thank you.
so, obviously I go into a lot of these conversations as being an IP attorney, and oftentimes I want to be more of a teacher and not necessarily an advisor. But a
Yeah.
lot of times I feel like the mentees want to force me into the advisor role and just say,
Right.
it's great to learn all that, but I really just want to get the answer. How do I kind of buffer that a little bit and get them to invest a little bit more time so they can grow and develop and learn maybe more skills from that, as opposed to, here's the answer? Because for me, I have the answer. I probably know what the answer is going to be, but I don't want to, as you said, if I'm mentoring them, I really want them to learn from themselves on how to do that.
Yeah, Dan, you raise a really good point, and you are in a bind alongside corporate attorneys who also are advising students, and we have financial people, about how to do pro formas and whatnot, who are advising students. And so, I think in your circumstance, Dan, for you to move more towards the advising and just come out with the answer, the technical answer is fine. I think maybe from a strategy perspective, rather than just as you move away from the kind of the nuts and bolts of patenting and provisionals and all the crazy stuff. I think for experts like you with that specific kind of technical expertise, it's fine for you to be a little bit more on the advising end of that spectrum. And then look for opportunities to say, hey, people do this particular thing in all different kinds of ways. Here's some resources you might draw on to come to your own conclusions about how to behave as it pertains to intellectual property. Well, thank you for those good questions, you guys. I really appreciate it. We're now going to drop into these breakout rooms. Liz Malone has got these things set up. We have one student founder joining each of the breakout rooms. And what I'll have you do is when you get into the breakout room, if somebody says, oh, hey, I'll be the mentor, the student is just going to quickly describe what their venture is about, and they're going to pose a real problem that they're struggling with. And so we'll be looking for a mentor to agree to do that in each room. If nobody quickly volunteers, here's how you're going to decide who the mentor is. There will be a room number at the top of your window, and whoever's birth date within a month is the closest to that room number, you're the mentor, okay? So if you're in room 3 and you were born on the 3rd of the month, then you're the mentor. So a volunteer would be lovely. Absent that, you get volunteered on the basis of the day of the month that you were born relative to the room. So we're going to just pop everybody into a room, and I may kind of dance around between rooms. Just try to have a good time, have a natural conversation, maybe use some of the techniques that we've talked about today.
Awesome. I'm about to open all the rooms, and I don't know if Jason had already said this, but these are all incoming B-Lab 2021 cohort members. So they are about to get mentored all summer.
So we're going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes in here. So it's going to be it's going to be sort of compressed, but have a good time, and we'll come back and talk in just a few minutes. All right. Well, I think just looking around the room, I think we've got pretty much everybody back in. I know that was a very rushed and perhaps not especially realistic experience in mentoring and being mentored. But what I'd like to do is just first of all ask an open-ended question, which is, or an open-ended invitation. If any of the mentors experience something, either as the person actually doing the mentoring or somebody observing someone else mentoring, something especially interesting or challenging in what emerged in your session with the student. Does anybody have anything notable that they want to bring up? And then I'll ask the students in just a moment as well. Hamza, what did you see in your room that was interesting or notable?
Hi, Jason. So I was with Ryan, who's building mechanical keyboards.
Yes.
And I don't think he learned anything from me, but I certainly learned a lot from him because he educated me on the existence of this industry / hobbyist space that I had no idea about till about 15 minutes ago. And I knew that people would tinker around and make all kinds of computers with these neon lights and funky heat sinks, but I had no idea that, building a keyboard in your basement was actually a thing. And the click
Who
and
knew?
the clock that those buttons made were acoustically sort of like, there's a difference in all the voices that come out when you press the buttons, and you can throw a whole bunch of different things together to create something cool. So I said to Ryan, I said, listen, I don't know if I was a good mentor, but I certainly, I'm somebody that learned from you. And, I think sometimes this flows both ways.
Well, so that's great, and thank you, Ryan, for being such a great instructor of Hamza Ansari. But I'm curious, Hamza, you also have a lot of experience working with student ventures, and the situation you were in is not uncommon. Although we strive to get sector, sector specific expertise, what do you do in that circumstance where it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about? Does it mean you can't be an effective mentor? It's just like, well, I don't know what you're doing. I'm out of here.
Well, so I mean, I'll go back to a point which you made earlier, Jason, which is that nobody knows the venture or the space better than the entrepreneur themselves, right?
Yeah.
And in a situation like this, what I would do is I just ask them to take a step back and think about the bigger picture, think about the value that they're trying to create and the change they want to create in the world. And then I'd ask more general questions. And sometimes when as an entrepreneur, you're so close to your product and to your company that when you step back and you take somewhat of an outside in perspective and you ask these questions, you're really able to distill down to the core of any problem that you might be facing. And
Right.
it's especially helpful if you have an outside perspective that's coming in. So that's sort of what I would do in a situation like that.
Gotcha.
And
Well, and sometimes I would say that's actually really, really helpful, because I think what happens, not just to young entrepreneurs, but anybody who's really passionate about what they're doing, they're just like really focused in on that thing. And so just to have somebody friendly and helpful from outside of their brain or outside of their venture say, hey, you know what, just take a second and step back and let's come back into this thing with maybe a broader worldview or something. So thanks for that. Uh, any other mentors? And then we'll ask for student impressions as well. Uh, any other mentoring experiences that were notable?
I, I would just, hi, it's Chris Brown here. Can you hear
Thank
me?
you, Chris.
Hey, yeah, how are you, Jason? I was on with Zoe, who's building essentially an organization to mentor and train the next generation of political and other activists.
Gotcha.
Trying to short circuit what has taken her and her co-founder, many years to learn, thinking that they, don't need to repeat the wheel or reinvent the wheel each
Right.
time. You can start, can learn from people more experienced and get going more quickly. And what I thought was interesting, but also important, is that, it's myself and two other, I'm going to assume, in this presumptuous white cisgender middle-aged men mentoring
Okay.
this young person, probably around issues that, again, I absolutely believe systemic racism exists, are, so interesting, but also on some levels, we're exactly the people who should be advocating. In other words, like, for this, and should be helping mentor it. But we
Right.
almost need some tools as well. I was struggling anyway, it was a very interesting discussion, and I'm inspired to try to help Zoe.
Hmm.
But it's interesting because on some levels, she might be more comfortable perhaps with some mentors who were not three white cisgender middle-aged men. But at the same
Gotcha.
time, to the extent she can engage us, we have great ability to really make her organization be successful, because we can push forward in a way that oftentimes other people cannot. And so I just think that dynamic can exist, and often does exist, in the mentor-mentee relationship in other contexts than just what I described. And both sides need to navigate that and think about that. I don't know,
Yeah.
Zoe, if
Yeah.
you have some thoughts based upon what I just said, I'd be curious to hear.
Well, I do, but I'd like to hear from Zoe. I mean,
But that's what I
it's
meant. I wondered if
oh,
Zoe wanted to.
yeah. So Zoe, nice job working with that crowd. How did you feel, Zoe, about having to try to educate people who maybe don't have your shared experience?
Oh, I don't know if I'd say educate, but it is, I think, a challenge that we've continually run up against when we're trying to
Ah,
explain our culture, is that, and I don't think this is because y'all are three white men, but a lot of the time when we say political advocacy or when we say political campaigning, what people assume is something very different from what we're imagining.
ah,
They're thinking of go get out the vote, right? Like tell your parents to vote, which is really like very um, moderate and probably a little bit more palatable compared to what Karina and I really want to be doing. And that's always a
gotcha.
concern for us, is how people are going to respond when we give them a venture idea, and how much time we're going to have to spend just defending why we know our theory is more correct.
Hmm.
That's something I'm always worried about. That being said, I enjoyed a conversation, like I would say that Chris definitely put like a lot of effort into just like making that conversation comfortable and not purely productivity oriented, and creating a space where I felt that I could trust him,
Right.
trust his opinions.
Right.
Obviously, the diversity of mentorship is going to be important, but I thought it was a good conversation.
Yeah. So, Zoe, nice job. And I think you sounds like you've already kind of run into something that all ventures struggle with, whether they're of your sort or anything else. It's kind of like, how do I talk about my venture? How can I introduce my sometimes rather complex ideas in a this is why having a more enduring mentor-mentee relationship is so valuable. That if you're always starting from ground zero in every interaction with a prospective venture, it's just like, oh my God, it's just so exhausting to have to talk about, all of the basics. You don't have time then to really dig in. So thank you for that. And other students, I'm curious what did you, I'm actually, so Yentine, I want to hear from you, but I kind of told the students to expect that standard opening question like, what's on your mind today? I'm curious if any of the mentors actually said, what's on your mind today? But Yentine, what was your experience?
Hi, yeah. So I just wanted to speak to kind of what Zoe was saying also. It's just like, how do you really communicate your venture in a concise and yet still nuanced way? And I definitely first want to thank both Chris and Molly for being the mentors in my group. They were both very lovely and asked me really thoughtful questions. And I do feel like the explanation of our venture took up more, if not all of the time allotted.
Oh,
And I definitely need to get better at explaining it more concisely so that I can get to a point where I can ask those questions and really pick their brains about what they feel like we should do with our current outstanding problems. And so we honestly didn't really get to that, but nonetheless, they were both amazing listeners, very, very insightful questions that I really appreciated.
fantastic.
And yeah, so it was lovely.
Fantastic. Chris, I'll get to you in just a second. There was a really interesting question. Ali Amin, I don't know if you're still on. I'm looking around to see if, yeah,
I am
Ali.
on. Yes, I am on.
Do you mind just saying out loud the question that you put in chat? I think it's fascinating.
So, well, I have been approached at times, and people have asked me questions. Not at, I mean, it was an innocent, random question, and I was asked by some student, and this was what the way I thought about the whole incident. Should I start talking and build the relationship, build the mentorship, while I may not have the best experience about the issue? Should I sometimes have the courage to say, I think you'd better look for the answer somewhere else. I may not be the best person to mentor you. But I mean, this is what I always think about. I mean, I really enjoyed your talk and the short discussion that we had with the student entrepreneur, because I thought that I could provide some guidance, but if that is the right thing to do, that's my question. What do you think? Should we go ahead and start in our own way mentoring people, or should we take a step back and make sure first that we are providing the best answer?
So thank you. That's a very, very insightful question. And Danny, I'll ask your opinion. I'm going to say something, and then you might provide your insights as well. So I think it is absolutely fair for you to wonder, not just in your own mind, but out loud, whether you're the right person to mentor a particular venture. The types of things that you might be mentoring on might be, if it's something highly technical or something that you just don't know anything about, then of course it doesn't make sense for you to sign up to be an ongoing mentor. And maybe even the sector that's being talked about is just something that is so outside of your experience, either personal or business, that there's just never gonna be that really tight overlap. I'll give you one example, and then I want to hear from Danny. we had a venture last year by someone from RISD who was, I won't get into all the details. It's fascinating and a wonderful venture. It was in the pet space. All right. I'll just put it that way. And, we found a mentor for her who actually had had a lot of experience selling pet food. And that was a wonderful overlap. But Ali, to your point, if you had never owned a pet, if you don't like dogs and cats, if then it might not be a marriage made in heaven as a mentor-mentee relationship. And I think it's fair for you to say, I think maybe you're gonna benefit more by speaking to someone else. Danny, what's your experience in gracefully backing out of a mentoring situation?
Well, I think you're right. It would be unusual if every proposed mentor relationship were ideal. That would
Right.
probably not be expected. But one thing that many of us have is a robust network. And we can at least think about mining that network so that we could introduce the person we just met to somebody else who might be that much better. I mean, I look at somebody like Chris Brown, who's just magical at that and incredibly generous about, even if they're not the perfect match on an ongoing mentorship basis, he is always generous about trying to find somebody else to introduce them to. So I think at a minimum, that's something that most of us can do. I don't want to say all of us, but most of us can do. And it may not happen in the moment. It might take a little bit of percolating that, and a week later, a month later, a few months later, you're like, aha, here's somebody in the pet industry that I might be able to introduce that person to. So it's both in the moment. Can you think of somebody somebody else who might be? And also, can you keep them in mind so that down the line, if you meet somebody, you could circle back. And then what you've done is created a network of people who are always on the lookout for ways that they can add value. That's wonderful.
Perfect. Thank you, Danny. That's a good idea. So I'm going to have Chris be the last question for the session here, Chris Masto. And then what we'll do is we'll let everybody, obviously you can always take off when you need to. We'll hear from Chris, and then I'm happy to hang around and delighted to continue the conversation even after this, but we want to respect your need to move on to your busy day. So Chris, what's on your mind?
Well, great to see you all, and really
thanks.
enjoyed speaking with Yentine. And I just had a quick follow-up really to her, comment that sometimes it can be, you can take a good amount of time, probably an endless amount of time, to just describe the business and get into all the nuances of what the entrepreneur is thinking about, and a little bit of show and tell. And I really enjoyed that. I think, we had a great conversation just hearing about it. But and then we saw the warning flash up, and so Yentine started to say, just as I was starting to say, oh, we've got 2 minutes, I was going to ask what's on your mind.
So good for you.
Well, but and so I mean, the only thought is, maybe it's useful in these conversations to actually have the entrepreneurs, even before jumping into a description of their business, to just say, the thing I'd love to spend time on today is, a strategy question, or just frame it a little bit before you even dive into what the business is.
Okay,
so that
interesting.
As the mentors are kind of hearing and processing what the business is, they can be, thinking ahead a bit to that question. And if time runs out, to just at least have a few relevant thoughts to that question, because we didn't even really get a chance to hear what was on Yentine's mind. Anyway, but
well, she'll put her email address in chat for you, Chris, so she can tell you what's on her mind. But no, your frustration is absolutely right on, and that's knowing that we didn't have a long time. That would have been a great strategy. So thank you for mentoring us. And that I'm really serious. I think that would have been, given the time constraints, it might have been cool to suggest that the students kind of flip it. Might have made it a little more
well, or to suggest a sort of a framework to whatever time frame, when people are heading into these conversations. To say, if you have this much time, try to use 2 minutes to give the discussion of the business, and then get at your questions, so you can have, just helping them think about time, time management to whatever the allotted time is.
Fair point.
But again,
Fair point.
It's a lot of fun. So
yeah,
thank you.
Great. Thank you. So listen, Liz Malone has put a couple of things in the chat. Most importantly, just that the next one of these mentoring and focus sessions is on June 24th. So you may want to keep that on your calendar and register. And I thank all of you for taking time out of your busy lives to talk about mentoring student ventures. So like I said, we'll stop the recording now, and I'm going to hang around if anybody wants to chat for a minute. But most of all, thank you again for making yourself available to learn about mentoring and to spend a little time with our cool students who are going to be in B Lab starting next week. So thanks again.